It was Christmas Eve, and I never imagined I'd be standing outside my own family home, shivering in the cold, with my 6-year-old son clinging to my hand, watching the lights twinkle through frosted windows that were now completely off-limits. Have you ever had someone you love, someone who is supposed to protect you, turn into the very obstacle you thought you'd never face? That's exactly what happened to me that night. One moment, I was expecting the warm smell of cinnamon cookies and the familiar crackle of the fireplace. The next, I was staring at a door that slammed shut on my face, with a little boy looking up at me like the world had just collapsed. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. We had driven 30 minutes through a soft blanket of snow, the car heating up our chilled cheeks, listening to Christmas music that suddenly felt cruelly ironic. My son, Ethan, his cheeks flushed pink from the cold, was humming along to the carols, his innocence making the sting of reality even sharper. I squeezed his hand, trying to muster a smile. "It'll be okay, buddy," I whispered, but my own voice shook. Have you ever felt that split-second panic when a parent realizes that the people who raised them can also be the ones who hurt them the most? That was exactly what I felt. When my mother, Karen, opened the door, her face was a mask I didn't recognize. Usually, she smiled at Ethan, fussed over his coat, and teased me about being late. But that night, she looked right through me, her lips tight. "You're not welcome here," she said, like it was the simplest, most natural thing in the world. Then, without another word, she shut the door. And, just like that, our plans, our tradition, our night gone. Have you ever been so stunned that you couldn't even respond? That's exactly how I felt. My stomach dropped. Ethan's hand squeezed mine tighter. "Mommy, why did Grandma do that?" he asked, his voice small and confused. I didn't have an answer. Not yet. And what made it worse was that this wasn't random. There had been tension simmering in our family for years, but I never imagined it would boil over like this, right on Christmas Eve. As we trudged back to the car, snow crunching under our boots, my mind raced. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, maybe my mom had a bad day, maybe something happened with my dad I didn't know about. But deep down, I knew this was different. There was intent behind that door slam. It was final, deliberate, and it cut sharper than any argument we had ever had. Then, 10 minutes later, my phone rang. The screen flashed a name that seemed impossible in that moment: Grandma. Margaret Collins, my mother's mother, the quiet force in our family who usually stayed in the background during fights. Her voice, calm and steady, filled the car. "Come back. Bring your keys." That simple line should have been comforting. It wasn't. Instead, it left me more confused than ever. Why would she tell us to come back? Why now? And what on earth could she possibly mean by this? As we walked back to the house, my mind spun through every scenario. Was it a trap? Was my mother testing me? I glanced at Ethan. His small hand was warm in mine, his wide eyes reflecting the house lights like tiny mirrors of innocence. I tried to focus on him, tried to shield him from my growing fear, but the tension in the air was almost tangible. You know that feeling when a single moment stretches out into eternity? That's exactly what walking up the path felt like. Each step brought a mix of dread and hope, and every second made me question what we were about to walk into. When we opened the door, it wasn't the crying, the pleading, the remorse I expected. Grandma wasn't emotional in that way. She stood in the hallway, holding a folder under her arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her eyes were calm, calculating, almost unreadable. And then she spoke one sentence. One. That sentence would make my parents completely stunned, paralyze them in a way that made every past argument, every small resentment, feel like child's play compared to what was about to unfold. I won't tell you what she said just yet, because that revelation, that shocking moment, is only the beginning. But I will tell you this. Everything I thought I knew about my family, everything I believed about loyalty, trust, and protection was about to be turned upside down. And Ethan? He had no idea how much his little hand would soon grip mine for more than just warmth. I remember stepping over the threshold of that house, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would echo through the walls. The warmth hit us first, the soft glow of Christmas lights, the smell of pine needles mixed with old carpet, and faint cinnamon drifting from the kitchen. It should have been comforting. It should have told Ethan he was safe. But there was nothing comforting about the look in Grandma Margaret's eyes that night. Calm, unshaken, quietly commanding. She was holding something under her arm, a folder, plain, unassuming, but the weight it carried was heavier than any physical object I'd ever lifted. "Come in," she said, voice steady, almost serene. Her tone was strange, oddly detached from the storm that had just unfolded at the door. No tears. No panic. Not even a hint of the anxiety I had expected. I glanced at Ethan. He looked at her, his small brow furrowed. "Grandma, what's in that folder?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to tell him not to ask. I wanted to shield him from the tension that seemed to vibrate in the air. But of course, that wasn't possible. I followed her into the living room, my mind racing. Each step I took felt heavier than the last. I kept thinking about how quickly everything had escalated. One minute, we're supposed to be celebrating together, the next, we're locked out in the snow. And here's the thing about families, they have a way of keeping secrets so well that you only notice the cracks when the walls collapse. Grandma had always been quiet, the observer, the one who never took sides openly. But now I realized she had been waiting for the perfect moment. And Christmas Eve had turned out to be it. Karen and Richard, my parents, were still standing near the kitchen doorway, faces pale and frozen. Karen's lips moved as if she wanted to say something, but no sound came out. Richard shuffled his feet, looking like a man caught between disbelief and fear. That's when Grandma shifted slightly, holding the folder a little higher, letting her presence dominate the room without a word. You could almost hear the tension snapping, like a stretched rubber band ready to break. "Your father and mother are about to lose this house," she said, her voice measured, deliberate. "And you might not believe why." The room went still. Ethan clutched my hand, peering over at me, sensing that something monumental was happening. I could feel my pulse in my temples. How could Grandma know? How could she predict this? And more importantly, why had she chosen now of all nights to intervene? I realized then that this wasn't just about a Christmas Eve argument or a minor family spat. This was bigger. Much bigger. Grandma had been planning quietly, silently, behind the scenes, observing, documenting, waiting for the moment when the right pieces would fall into place. And now, all of us, even my parents, the people who had always thought they controlled the narrative, were entirely at her mercy. I asked her, trying to steady my voice, "Grandma, what are you talking about?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let her eyes sweep the room, taking in my parents' frozen expressions, Ethan's worried little face, and me standing there, trying to keep my composure. Then she opened the folder just slightly, enough for the corner of a paper to peek out. I caught a glimpse of typed words, official-looking stamps, signatures, and numbers. My heart skipped. Financial documents? Legal papers? And then I realized these weren't just any papers. This was a chess move of unimaginable foresight. Grandma's calmness made the moment feel surreal. She had always been meticulous, organized, methodical, but to see her wield that skill now, as if orchestrating a storm behind the placid facade of her kitchen, was staggering. I glanced at Karen. For the first time in years, my mother looked small, unsure, unsteady. And Richard. He looked like a man realizing that all the quiet compromises and soft words of his life were about to collapse in front of him. Grandma shifted her stance, letting the folder rest lightly on the side table, and finally spoke again. "I've been preparing for this for months," she said. "I couldn't let you be treated unfairly, and I couldn't wait any longer." Her words hit like ice water. For months? What had she been doing behind the scenes? And how had we all missed it? I felt a shiver run down my spine, part fear, part awe. I realized then that my son's little hand in mine was all the anchor I had in that moment. Ethan didn't fully understand, of course, but he knew something serious was happening. He clung to me tighter. "What did you do?" Karen whispered, finally finding her voice, trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. Grandma didn't answer directly. Instead, she let silence hang, thick and heavy. And I could feel it. The anticipation, the weight of every family secret, every past argument, every small injustice building up like a crescendo. I realized then that Christmas Eve was no longer about presents or decorations. It was about power, justice, and the truth finally surfacing. And that's when Grandma said something so simple, so calm, that it froze the room completely. If you don't start listening. If you continue locking people out and making decisions that hurt those who matter most, the consequences will be irreversible. I looked at her, confused and horrified. My parents' faces went pale. Ethan's eyes grew wide. And I knew in that moment that this Christmas Eve would not end with turkey and laughter. Something far larger, far more shocking, was about to unfold. The room was silent for a moment after Grandma's warning, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes every breath feel heavy. Ethan fidgeted, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, still holding my hand tightly. I tried to comfort him, but I couldn't stop my own thoughts from racing. What had Grandma been preparing for all these months? And more importantly, why hadn't we noticed any of it before? Grandma Margaret finally lifted the folder from the table and opened it fully, revealing a stack of documents that looked almost ordinary at first glance. But as I leaned closer, my stomach dropped. This wasn't just ordinary paperwork. These were legal documents, contracts, and letters, meticulously compiled, all pointing to the mistakes, oversights, and dangerous financial decisions my parents had made over the years. There were property deeds, unpaid bills disguised as miscellaneous expenses, and even correspondence from lawyers and accountants that Karen and Richard had apparently ignored or buried. I could feel my pulse in my throat. "Grandma, you've been doing this all this time?" I whispered. She nodded slightly, her expression calm but unyielding. "I've been watching, documenting, and preparing. I didn't want to interfere, not until it was absolutely necessary. And now it is." Karen stepped forward, her voice sharp but shaky. "Necessary? Margaret, this is Christmas Eve. You can't just." Grandma held up a hand, cutting her off instantly. "No, Karen. You don't get to lecture me. Not tonight. Not after everything you've done to Laura and Ethan." My jaw tightened. Every word was deliberate, every pause perfectly timed. Grandma had always been quiet, yes, but I had never realized the depths of her patience or her strategy. And then it hit me. She wasn't just protecting me emotionally. She was protecting me legally. And she had done it in a way that my parents, in their arrogance and neglect, had no idea how to counter. I could see Richard's hands tremble slightly as he glanced at the papers. "Margaret, what does this mean?" he asked, his voice low, uncertain. "It means," Grandma began, her tone measured, "that if either of them continues to try to control, manipulate, or lock you out, the legal ownership of this house, the very place you grew up in, could be taken from them. It would then fall under your control, Laura, and Ethan's, to protect you both." Ethan's eyes widened. He tugged at my sleeve. "Mommy, does that mean Grandma's saving us?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my own voice steady. "Yes, buddy, she is." The room seemed to shrink around us, the warmth of the house doing nothing to temper the tension. Karen's face went pale. I had seen her confident, controlling, almost untouchable in family arguments before, but now she looked like a cornered animal. And Richard, he seemed frozen, the kind of frozen you see in people who are realizing that the rules of the world they thought they understood no longer apply. I couldn't help but think about all the small ways Grandma had always prepared quietly. The savings account she insisted I have, the small inheritance she subtly guided me toward, the quiet advice she gave in passing about legal protections and trust funds. I had always thought of it as grandmotherly prudence. I had never realized it was strategic foresight, carefully calculated for a moment like this. Grandma lifted one of the sheets and pointed to a clause in what looked like a standard property document. "See this?" she said. "This clause was ignored. Your parents didn't notice it, and now it's the key." It gives you the right to protect yourselves. If they challenge it, they risk everything, including the house. Karen's lips quivered. You can't do this. It's exactly what I'm doing, Grandma interrupted. Her voice was calm, almost chillingly calm. I've been waiting for the right moment. That moment is now. The irony was almost unbearable. Karen, who had spent years trying to control every holiday, every decision, every argument about money, was suddenly powerless. And Richard, the supposed peacemaker, was realizing that his inaction had contributed to this collapse. All the years of dismissing small issues, ignoring warning signs, had led to this one moment. I glanced down at Ethan, who had been quietly observing everything. Even at 6, he seemed to sense the magnitude of what was happening. He tugged at my coat, and I knelt to meet his eyes. Everything's going to be okay, Ethan, I whispered, but even I had to wonder just how okay things could be after this night. Grandma closed the folder slowly, deliberately, letting the gravity of her actions sink in. I couldn't save your mother or father from themselves, she said softly, almost to herself. But I could make sure you two were protected. For a brief moment, the room was silent. You could almost hear the echoes of past Christmases, arguments long buried, small injustices that had been overlooked, all converging into this one night. And then Grandma said something that made my stomach drop. There's one more piece to this. One more thing that will make all of you understand just how serious this is. Karen's eyes narrowed, Richard's jaw tightened, and Ethan's small hand gripped mine like a lifeline. I felt my pulse in my ears. What could Grandma possibly have left as the final revelation? And how would my parents react when they realized the full extent of her plan? But what Grandma revealed next would completely stun us, and I knew, without a doubt, that this Christmas Eve would be remembered forever. The moment Grandma spoke those final words, the room seemed to shrink, the air thick with anticipation. Karen's eyes narrowed, Richard's fingers drummed nervously against the counter, and Ethan's small hand clutched mine like it could anchor both of us against the storm. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but every instinct in my body screamed that what was about to happen would change everything we knew about our family. Grandma Margaret straightened, letting the folder rest on the side table. Then, with a calmness that made my heart race, she began to explain exactly what she had orchestrated. I couldn't let this night pass without ensuring that the people who matter most to me, Laura and Ethan, are safe, she said. Her eyes met mine, and in that instant, I realized she wasn't just speaking words. She was speaking power, authority, and protection, wrapped in a quiet, unstoppable force. I glanced at my parents. Karen's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to catch words that wouldn't come. Richard's face was pale, as if the floor had fallen out from under him. And Ethan, his eyes were wide, staring at Grandma with the kind of innocent awe only a 6-year-old can feel when someone steps into a role they never imagined existed. Grandma continued, her voice deliberate. Because of previous mismanagement, ignored clauses, and unchecked decisions over the past several years, the ownership of this house was at risk. But I anticipated the possibility. So I took steps to protect it, to protect Laura and Ethan. If anything happens tonight, if your actions continue to threaten them, the house legally belongs to them. The words landed like a hammer striking steel. I could feel my knees weaken slightly. Ethan whispered, "Mommy, is Grandma saying we own it?" "Yes, buddy," I whispered back, my voice trembling slightly, trying to sound reassuring. But even as I said it, I felt a strange rush, a mix of relief, awe, and disbelief. Grandma had literally shielded us from our parents' recklessness. Karen's face went ashen, and her voice rose, shaking with fury. "Margaret, you can't just, this is insane. You can't take away our house." Grandma's calmness didn't waver. She lifted one of the documents from the folder and laid it on the table. "This isn't about taking anything. This is about protecting. You've been warned. And the legal safeguards are in place. If you continue your behavior, there will be consequences. Not because I want it, but because it's necessary." Richard finally found his voice, though it was weak, almost pleading. "Margaret, what are you really saying? Are you giving the house to them?" Grandma nodded slowly. Not giving. Protecting. It's there right now, and it will remain that way if you fail to act responsibly. This is not punishment. It's justice in the form of protection. I felt a mixture of shock and gratitude. All these years, I had thought Grandma was just quietly neutral during family arguments. I had never imagined she had been quietly building a fortress for me and Ethan, a fortress strong enough to withstand even our parents' authority. The irony was almost painful. Karen, who spent decades controlling everything about our lives, suddenly powerless against Grandma's quiet, deliberate action. Ethan tugged at my sleeve, and I knelt beside him. "Do you see that, Ethan?" "Grandma's making sure we're safe," I whispered. He nodded, wide-eyed, still trying to process the strange mix of fear, awe, and relief. The tension in the room escalated as Grandma walked over to the fireplace and leaned slightly on the mantel, her posture relaxed but commanding. I've always watched quietly, planning silently, because I didn't want to interfere unnecessarily. But there comes a point when watching is not enough. This, tonight, is that point. Karen's voice rose in disbelief and fury, but it was weak against the weight of truth. Richard's hands were trembling. He looked like a man realizing that the rules he had relied upon for decades had changed, and he had no control over them anymore. Grandma's eyes met mine again, and she said something so simple, so deliberate, that it struck me like lightning. "I've been waiting for the right moment to protect my daughter and grandson. Today is that moment." I felt a wave of emotions: relief, awe, gratitude, and a strange sense of vindication. Grandma had not only saved us emotionally, but legally. And she had done it without shouting, without confrontation, without crying. Just calculated, quiet, unstoppable strategy. For a moment, the room was still, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then Karen's voice broke through, sharp and trembling. "This isn't over." But Grandma didn't flinch. Her calmness was unnerving. "It is over, Karen. The rest is up to you. What happens next is your choice. But remember, I did this to protect the ones I love most. Nothing else matters tonight." I looked down at Ethan, who was still holding my hand, wide-eyed, but beginning to relax. I realized, for the first time, that Christmas Eve had become something entirely different, not just a holiday, not just a family gathering, but a turning point in our lives. Everything had shifted, and our family would never be the same again. And then Grandma added, almost as an afterthought, a subtle smile playing on her lips, "I've left one final piece for the future. Something for next Christmas, but that is a story for another time." The weight of her words hung in the room, teasing, hinting, leaving a lingering question. What else did she know? What other plans had she quietly laid, waiting for the right moment? But that night, in that living room, with the snow falling gently outside and the lights of the Christmas tree glowing softly, one thing was certain: Grandma had won, my parents were stunned, and Ethan and I were safe, at least for now. The Christmas Eve twist had been delivered, and the fallout had just begun. The room was quiet after Grandma's revelation, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that hums with tension, disbelief, and a strange undercurrent of awe. Karen sat slumped in a chair, staring at the documents on the table as though they were written in a language she couldn't read. Richard leaned against the wall, hands in his pockets, shaking slightly, his eyes wide. And Ethan, still holding my hand, looked up at me with a mixture of confusion and wonder. I sank into the sofa, my mind racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. In a matter of minutes, our world had shifted completely. The warm, familiar home I had stepped into hours ago had become a battlefield of control, strategy, and quiet triumph. And at the center of it all stood Grandma Margaret, calm, unshakable, and victorious. I thought about all the Christmases before this one, the arguments over decorations, gifts, and money. The small slights and silent resentments that had built up over the years. At the time, I had thought they were minor, trivial family disputes. But now, in the glow of the Christmas tree lights and the weight of legal papers in the room, I understood that those small conflicts were nothing compared to the consequences of unchecked control. Grandma had waited, watched, and acted only when it truly mattered. I looked down at Ethan, who had been quiet for a long time, absorbing the tension in the room. "Mommy, are we really safe now?" he asked, his voice small and cautious. I smiled, squeezing his hand. "Yes, Ethan. Thanks to Grandma, we are." But it wasn't just safety that Grandma had secured. She had created something far more important: respect, boundaries, and the knowledge that no one, not even the people who raised me, could make decisions for us without consequences. It was a powerful lesson, one that I felt deep in my chest. The quiet strength, foresight, and courage she displayed that night left me in awe. Karen finally found her voice, trembling but loud enough for everyone to hear. This isn't fair. You can't just." Grandma didn't respond. Her calm, unwavering gaze said everything. "Actions speak louder than words," she seemed to be saying, and tonight, her actions had spoken louder than any argument my mother could muster. I took a deep breath and stepped closer to the folder, glancing at the documents that had once seemed so intimidating. Every clause, every letter, every signature was now a shield protecting Ethan and me from the chaos that had threatened to consume our family. And yet, the legal technicalities were only part of the story. The emotional weight, the betrayal, the fear, the shock, the eventual relief was what would stay with me long after the papers were signed or filed. I thought back to the very beginning of the night, standing outside in the cold, feeling that icy sting of rejection. The memory was sharp, a reminder of just how close we had come to being powerless. And yet, Grandma had turned it all around. She had transformed a moment of fear, confusion, and vulnerability into one of empowerment, protection, and revelation. Ethan leaned his head against my arm, exhausted but secure. "Grandma's like a superhero," he murmured, his voice full of innocence and admiration. I smiled, ruffling his hair. "Yes, she is," I whispered back. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Superheroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they carry folders. Sometimes they wait quietly for the right moment. Sometimes they make sure the people they love are safe when no one else can. As the night drew on, Karen and Richard retreated to separate corners of the room, silently processing the reality that their control had been stripped away, their authority challenged, and their mistakes exposed. And I watched Grandma, her calm demeanor unchanged, knowing that the quiet force in our family had just ensured the safety and future of 2 generations, me and my son. Before heading to the kitchen to pour us some hot cocoa, Grandma gave me a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Remember, Laura," she said softly, "sometimes the people you think will protect you last are the ones who fail. And the quiet ones, the ones who watch and wait, they end up being your heroes." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink deep into my heart. She had taught me a lesson about patience, foresight, courage, and the unexpected ways that love manifests. Not in grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but in preparation, strategy, and action when it matters most. And just as I was about to take a sip of cocoa, Grandma added something that made the room tense again. "I've left one final surprise for next Christmas, but that story will have to wait." The words hung in the air like a whisper of suspense. A small smile tugged at the corners of my lips, a mix of curiosity and cautious anticipation. What else had Grandma planned? What other lessons were waiting to unfold? For now, I didn't need answers. The night had already given me so much. I looked at Ethan, who was finally smiling again, small cocoa cup warming his hands. I realized that Christmas Eve would never be just another holiday in our family. It had become a turning point, a story of betrayal, courage, and unexpected triumph. And thanks to Grandma, we weren't just surviving the night, we were standing stronger than ever, ready for whatever came next. That night, I learned that family isn't always what you expect. Heroes don't always announce themselves. And sometimes, the quietest people wield the most power.